What's up, guys? This is Chris from draftdashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 12.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and give you my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL this week. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to dominate your season-long fantasy leagues. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football leagues. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, NFL Week 12. Let's take a look at my starts and sits. Remember, we have the Thursday Thanksgiving games, so I'm going to include some players from those games in this video. If it's already past Thursday, don't worry, we got starts and sits from the Sunday games as well. Okay, let's take a look at the quarterback position. For the Thanksgiving games, I'm going to start Alex Smith from the Washington football team playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the third worst defense overall, and they give up the fifth most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Now, Alex Smith, he scored 9, 19, and 17 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So he had a bad week last week, but now he's got a great matchup here versus the Dallas Cowboys. He's 5,400 DraftKings salary, 1,300 more on FanDuel. He's projected at 16.5 fantasy points here in Week 12. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, and they have the Washington football team trailing by 2.5. So you got a close, competitive game and a fantastic matchup. Quarterbacks look pretty good against this Dallas defense, so I'm going to start Alex Smith here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Okay, for the Sunday games, I'm going to start Matt Ryan from the Atlanta Falcons playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the 9th worst defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Matt Ryan has averaged 19.3 fantasy points per game on the season, and he's coming off of a bad game as well. Only 7 fantasy points last game, but he scored 23 and 19 fantasy points in the games before that. He's projected at 18.5 fantasy points here in Week 12. He's 5,900 DraftKings salary and 1,700 more on FanDuel. So he's got a great matchup here. I think this is going to be a close game, a passing game script. So I like Matt Ryan to bounce back here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Okay, what quarterback are we going to sit here in Week 12? Now, this guy had a monster 33-point fantasy game 3 games ago, but since then he's come back down to earth. I'm going to sit Drew Locke from the Denver Broncos playing the New Orleans Saints, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing quarterbacks. Drew Locke has averaged 13.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3 rush attempts per game. So he scored 12, 11, and 33 fantasy points in the last 3 games, projected at 15.6 fantasy points here in Week 12. He's 5,100 DraftKings salary and 1,600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Broncos trailing by 6. So it's a bad matchup, and although it's going to be a passing game script for Drew Locke, I'm going to keep him on my bench this week. So I'm going to sit Drew Locke here versus the New Orleans Saints. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. A running back I'm going to start from the Thursday games is J.D. Mckissick from the Washington football team playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. J.D. Mckissick has averaged 10.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.6 pass targets per game and 4.9 rush attempts per game. Now take a look at his last 3 games. He scored 10, 18, and 17 fantasy points, but the reason that I like this play is because of his involvement in the passing game. In the last 3 games, he got 4, 15, and 14 pass targets. So although he only got 6, 8, and 3 rush attempts in those games, he more than makes up for it with those pass targets. He's projected at 12 fantasy points here in week 12. He's 5,100 DraftKings salary and 500 more on FanDuel. So I like this matchup versus an awful Dallas defense, especially if they involve him in the passing game. He could have a big game through the air as a running back. So I'm going to start J.D. Mckissick here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Okay, in the Sunday games, I'm going to start Kareem Hunt from the Cleveland Browns playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Kareem Hunt has averaged 15.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.7 rush attempts per game and 3 pass targets per game. So even though Nick Chubb is back, Kareem Hunt does really well with Nick Chubb in the lineup. He ended up getting 13 rush attempts and 1 pass target last game. He found the end zone for a touchdown, and now he's projected at 13.5 fantasy points here in week 12. He's 5,600 DraftKings salary and 1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Browns favored by 6.5. So fantastic matchup and a running game script. So I'm going to start Kareem Hunt here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Okay, what running back are we going to sit here in week 12? He's playing on Thursday, but I'm going to sit James Conner from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing running backs. James Conner has averaged 14.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.5 rush attempts per game and 3 pass targets per game. Now, he's had fantastic matchups for the last 3 weeks, and he only scored 13, 7, and 4 fantasy points. So now he's got a bad matchup versus the Baltimore Ravens, and although he is projected at 14.6 fantasy points here in week 12, and he's 6,200 DraftKings salary and 500 more on FanDuel, I don't like this matchup here, and Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game. Only 46 points scored in this game, with the Pittsburgh Steelers favored by 3. Now, if you don't have any other quality running backs, of course you got to start James Conner, but if you got some depth at your running back position, I think it's time to sit James Conner here versus the Baltimore Ravens.
Real quick guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. For the Thursday night Thanksgiving games, I'm going to start Marvin Jones Jr. from the Detroit Lions playing the Houston Texans, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Marvin Jones Jr. has averaged 11.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.7 pass targets per game. Now he's getting quite a bit of passing volume with Kenny Golladay out. He's gotten 20 pass targets in the last 3 games, scoring 9, 24, and 13 fantasy points. He's projected at 14.1 fantasy points here in week 12. He's $5,500 DraftKings salary and $500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50.5 points scored in this game, with the Detroit Lions trailing by 2. So great matchup, high scoring game, a passing game script. So I'm going to start Marvin Jones Jr. here versus the Houston Texans. Okay, another wide receiver I'm going to start. He plays on Sunday. I'm going to start Devonta Parker from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Jets, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Devonta Parker has averaged 12.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.5 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 80% of the snaps, and he got 9, 7, and 7 pass targets in the last 3 games. He scored 18 fantasy points last game, and he's projected at 12.9 fantasy points here in week 12. He's $5,900 DraftKings salary and $600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46 points scored in this game, and they have the Dolphins favored by 6.5. So I like that increase in passing volume that he's got over the past few games. It's a fantastic matchup, so I'm going to start Devonta Parker here versus the New York Jets. Okay, what wide receiver are we going to sit here in week 12? I'm going to sit Emanuel Sanders from the New Orleans Saints playing the Denver Broncos, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Emanuel Sanders has averaged 12.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.9 pass targets per game. Now he's only on the field for 59% of the snaps, and he's projected at 8.9 fantasy points here in week 12. He's $4,800 DraftKings salary and $800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, so a low-scoring game, and they have the Saints favored by 6. So it could be a running game script for the Saints. The matchup's not that great, and Sanders gets a bump down with Taysom Hill at quarterback. So I'm going to sit Emanuel Sanders here versus the Denver Broncos. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. For the Thanksgiving games on Thursday, I'm going to start Dalton Schultz from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Washington football team, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Dalton Schultz has averaged 9.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.1 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 81% of the snaps, and he scored 13, 9, and 11 fantasy points off of 6, 7, and 8 pass targets in the last 3 games. He's projected at 7.9 fantasy points here in week 12, and he's $3,800 DraftKings salary and $1,500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Dallas Cowboys favored by 2.5. So although the Washington football team has a good defense overall, they're vulnerable against the tight end position. So I'm going to start Dalton Schultz here versus the Washington football team. Another tight end I'm going to start, he plays on Sunday. I'm going to start Mckissick from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Jets, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Mckissick has averaged 8.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.6 pass targets per game. Now, normally I don't play Mckissick. He's only scored 8, 6, and 7 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 5, 5, and 4 pass targets, and he's projected at 8.7 fantasy points here in Week 12. He's 4,300 DraftKings salary and 1,300 more on FanDuel. But he's got a great matchup here versus the New York Jets. The Miami Dolphins are coming off of a tough loss last week, so it's a get-right spot in a bounce-back game. So I'm going to start Mckissick here versus the New York Jets. Okay, who are we going to sit at the tight end position? I'm going to sit Jared Cook from the New Orleans Saints playing the Denver Broncos, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they've been good defending opposing tight ends. Jared Cook has averaged 8.2 fantasy points per game in the season, getting an average of 3.9 pass targets per game. But that passing volume has dropped way off. He only got 1 pass target last game, scored 2 fantasy points. Now he's projected at 7.5 fantasy points here in Week 12, and he's 3,500 DraftKings salary and 2,300 more on FanDuel. But he's got a bad matchup here, and with Taysom Hill at quarterback, I can't trust these Saints pass catchers. Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game with the Saints favored by 6, so it should be a running game script for the Saints. So I'm going to sit Jared Cook here versus the Denver Broncos.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.